Hey guys, what's going on? Welcome back for another episode of Line Check. I'm super thrilled on today's episode. I have a guest that I've been trying to track down for a little bit, and we finally got the opportunity to sit down with. I can't wait to get talking with him. He's an incredible drummer. He has absolutely awesome YouTube channel and an incredible lesson website. His name's The Orlando Drummer on YouTube. On Instagram, it's InstaChops, and he's my friend, Adam Tuminaro. Adam, welcome. Thank you so much for doing this, man. Thank you for taking the time.
Absolutely, man. Thank you for having me, man. I'm stoked to be here. Been a little while since I've done a podcast.
All right, cool. So typically how these Line Check interviews work is I like to start with what's going on at the time and then do a little bit of a rundown on how you got to that point. So these days with COVID, there's a lot of uncertainty in the music industry, a lot of things that have had to be, I guess, adjusted and changed. And for guys who are teaching online lessons like you and myself, it's actually in some ways opened up some opportunities and made it so that we had to adapt in certain ways, but there's definitely some negatives and some positives. How has like the current, I guess, conditions of what's happened affected you, and has it, and in what ways?
Well, I would say initially when the big pop first happened, late March was when the stock market tanked, and when when quarantine first set in. And just like every other person in an online position, I definitely saw a crazy spike in signups, new members. That definitely stabilized in the months after that. So it wasn't like, holy shit, we're rich all of a sudden. It was just a really good month, maybe 2 months in a row that were very good. And then things sort of stabilized a bit. I think, to be in an online position, to offer a digital solution to what is normally like a physical solution, right? I think everybody in that position across the board was really happy to be online, right? It makes me glad that I had the intuition to go online, almost a decade ago now. And that's true for every industry. If you were positioned online and you had physical competitors, everybody was glad that they were online when all of this stuff happened. And I think the flip side of that, the con, was that the market immediately got more saturated. Everybody that was on the fence about doing online lessons is no longer on the fence. So they have all started pulling the trigger. But I'm a free market person. I think that's how it should work. I welcome competition, if we're going to call it that. But I also think, within music, it's such an art. I want more drummers. I want more drum teachers. I want more people inspired, more people playing drums. So it's also the more the merrier, So it's we're starting to stabilize now. The people that are really going hard doing online education and pushing, we're seeing those people come out and really get footholds. And for other people, it was just like a scary moment that they had to react to. And maybe I'll do some online stuff really quick, and that's fine too. But I welcome all newcomers for sure.
So when it comes to online, like let's say you are somebody who's, in their first 2 or 3 years of taking drum lessons, and you've been going to a local studio and you have a drum teacher that you go and physically sit down with, and you have 2 kits beside each other and you learn each week with. To a person in that situation, what do you find are some of the big adjustments when they're transitioning from actually physically being able to be in the room with their instructor to now having to sort of rely, I guess, a little bit maybe more on themselves and the online resources that they can uncover? What are some things that come up, and how would you recommend getting into taking online lessons for somebody in that position?
Sure. I think some people are naturally better equipped to be independent, to be, just self-taught almost in a way. Like some people, you can give them an iPhone and put them in a room by themselves with a drum set, and that works for them. They're really good at that. Other people, they struggle with that, certainly. So like you're saying, there would be a harsh contrast of like, I'm used to being in a room with someone and all of a sudden I'm more or less on my own. It's just a guy on a screen talking to me. I think it's a problem for some people, but not for everyone. But if you're someone who's dealing with that, right, and it's a harsh transition, I would think that what it really requires is a lot more self-discipline, right? You lose some accountability when you don't have a guy sitting across from you double checking to see if you're practicing every week and making little corrections along the way. I think online education requires a slightly higher amount of honesty with yourself, right? You have to be really honest about, have you learned this thing? Does it sound clean? Are you playing it correctly? And if you don't know, you obviously have to use the resources you have to try and figure that out. But at the same time, I think the element of a teacher like babysitting students has somewhat evaporated, right? If you don't have in-person lessons, the accountability just isn't there in the same way that it was before. And I think in part, that is on the student to sort of step up their game and say, well, you know what, if I really want to do this, it looks like nobody's holding my hand so directly anymore, right? Yeah, I think that's going to be the biggest thing somebody could do for themselves that's struggling to really get a grasp on online education. If it's your only option, bump up that accountability, you know? Not that I don't want to hold my students accountable, but when there's hundreds of thousands of them, it's a little different than 20 or 30 students in a week, right?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. I completely agree with what you're saying. I personally myself found that I guess just being of the generation that I kind of grew up in, like being born in 1995 and kind of coming up as the internet came up, a lot of my most of my ability at the kit was self-acquired through things like YouTube and things like platforms like yours, similar to yours, like other websites like, you know, Drum Beats Online, of course Orlando Drummer, and then Drumeo. I'm curious to hear about where what inspired you to start to take your instruction online. What was the, like, back in the day when you started all this, what was some things when you first started teaching online? Why was that the case? Why did you decide to do that?
Sure. So I had been thinking about it for years. I taught privately for a little while. A lot of kids first in the beginning, which I think is a pretty normal progression. I don't know that everybody should start teaching at a professional level. And so I taught a lot of kids when I was in maybe not late high school, really early college, 18, 19 years old. And man, I saw online education kind of sort of happening. There were only 2 or 3 guys in that whole game back then. And I was very much like you, self-taught. I would go to YouTube as like resource number 1 to try and find a new lick, a new chop, a new groove. And you know, back then, production standards were really low. There was really no standards, right? It was just guys with cameras who kind of sort of knew some stuff on the drums, and there was just a random collection of these people. But very few of them, very few of them were trying to make money, though, right? So it was a lot of like homemade sort of stuff. And I definitely remember being somewhat frustrated at guys who would explain something in a YouTube video, and they're 2 or 3 minutes in, and then they would go, oh, you know what? Well, never mind. I kind of said it wrong, and I wish I could, you know, go back. And they would sort of correct themselves and stumble on their words. And I used to get so frustrated, saying, why wouldn't you make this like any other movie? Why wouldn't you write somewhat of a script, somewhat of an outline, somewhat of a plan? If you messed up the playing part, like, why aren't we re-recording that? And I remember thinking this wouldn't be that hard to sort of take some of my lessons in person and turn them into kind of video lessons. And so that's what I did back in, man, maybe 2009 or 10 was probably my first video drum lessons. And it was a side project, honestly. It was not something that I thought I could ever really make money with. My lessons were really created I used them as like marketing for private students. So I would say, hey, if you learn a lesson from me in person, you go home and you forget it, I've got a lot of my lessons in video form. I'll send you a YouTube link and you can, you know, watch those. And then those lessons started getting a lot of views. Really, where I ended up pulling the trigger, though, was in 2013. I had a really big gig lined up, 3 or 4 month tour, and it completely fell through like last minute, like day before my flight. And I had given up all of my private students. I had like found teachers for them around town. So I was out of a job and had no students over the course of like 24 hours. And the way I saw it was the biggest asset that I had at the time was a YouTube channel with like 5,000 or 6,000 subscribers. So I just decided I'm going to go full force online and see how far I can take this, because I got 6,000 subscribers on accident. So what happens if I actually try and do this, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was almost 8 years ago.
Hell yeah, dude. That's really cool. So let's go even further back. Let's start at the beginning and talk about like what first introduced you to music in your early kind of childhood, and then what sort of turned you onto the drum set.
Sure. So let's see. Neither one of my parents were professional musicians, but they both kind of played some instruments a little. Both of them, I guess, piano, I guess. My mom sang in a church choir, and my dad always had pianos around. And both of my grandmothers were actually like professional pianists. They did it for a living for quite a while. So there was some music in the family, but we weren't like a music family. It's not like I had cousins or brothers or sisters that were pro players. I didn't really grow up around that. To be honest, I just loved drums as I heard them growing up. Linkin Park, Blink-182, Mudvayne.
Hell yeah.
Yeah, right. Just all of those bands, right? I definitely grew up a metalhead. By the time high school hit, it was Under Oath. Who else, man? Closure in Moscow, Circus Survive, Bless the Fall, and like the old versions of these bands, right? Went to Warped Tour at age 14, 15, 16. It was the coolest shit I had ever seen in my life. And so, yeah, I kind of got sucked into music in that world, right? A lot of the hardcore world is what sort of sucked me in. I didn't stay that kind of drummer, but I think it was more like a lot of it was social too. I had friends that listened to that kind of music. We would go to shows together. And that's just what sort of was so appealing to me, was like the community of music, right? And I had a lot of musician friends. It was in high school bands and things like that. So that whole world just kind of sucked me in. And I think a big part of it too was I did jazz band in high school. And I'm not a jazz player. I can't really read jazz music very well. I'm not like proficient in that genre. But that was just a good example of like a core group of friends, you know, a lot of drummers that we just sort of grew up in high school together. And it just got sucked into all of that, man.
Cool. So, what were let's talk about some of your early performance experiences. What age were you first involved with your first band, and how did that come to be?
First band was, what were we called? The Color Red. The Color Red was my first band. That was in high school. Right on. Yeah, right on. They're all just made up anyway. But yeah, we, high school band, did the high school talent show, did a couple of local venues. That was my first band experience. Dude, had total train wrecks on stage, would like improvise certain parts. This was a totally unprofessional like teenage band. So that was my first experience. The next big one though was where I got a huge majority of my playing and touring experience, and that was with a band that at the time was called the Crazy Carls, which was like a leftover inside joke name. Yeah, it was a guy named Alex Baugh. He now plays under the name Xander, still a full-time player. It was sort of like reggae pop-ish, like beachy pop, which works down here in Florida because you can get all the gigs in the world if you play any like beach-themed music. We would just go out to these like bars out on the coast and play a ton of gigs there. Did a few tours with him, did an EP at least, 6 or 7 music videos. And, that was where I got the festival experience, playing in front of 1,000+ people, 2,000+ people on tracks in the background with a click. And it was cool. The professionalism definitely got ramped up there. And to be honest, the only other original project I was ever part of was a band called Stockholm. And that was 2014, 15, around that time, sort of like a ambient indie rock sort of thing. And same sort of deal, up the professionalism, played some festivals, bigger shows, a lot of writing with backing tracks in the background. So the shows are like higher stakes, like you can't fuck up if we're running backing tracks. And so yeah, I got a lot of experience there. A couple other one-off tours, things like that. But yeah, that's about all my band experience, really.
Coming out of high school, correct me if I'm wrong, but you attended post-secondary for music, right?
Not quite for music, recording arts, recording engineering.
Okay, cool. So where did you go for that? And then what was that experience like?
So I went to a school called Full Sail. And I have a weird history with, with Full Sail. I'll just, full transparency, I'm not a fan of the school that I went to. I look at it as though I got a great education. Just like if you buy a Honda Civic, you got a great car. But if you paid 80 grand for that Honda Civic, you got totally fucked, dude. That's a horrible deal. Like, the car is still great, but you paid 3 times what it was worth. And that's how I perceived my education at Full Sail University. I learned great stuff, met a lot of cool people, but what it cost me, I couldn't possibly recommend that anybody else do the exact same thing. But yeah, I went for audio engineering. The biggest advantage of going to that particular school was they have so much gear. They have crazy, crazy gear. So I did get to mix on SSLs in like my 3rd month there. I mean, Rupert Neve boards, like, yeah, like multi-million-dollar boards that you're really not going to touch anywhere else in the world. So yeah, that was really cool. And I did learn a ton. But again, it's like buying that Honda Civic for 80 grand. You got a bad deal, bro. It's a horrible deal.
Yeah. So I'm curious on the front of post-secondary, being somebody who now, runs an online education platform for music, for drumming in particular. Would you say that for somebody looking to get into some sort of facet of the music industry, do you think that Well, maybe let's make that more specific. Do you think that for somebody looking to become a professional performer or session drummer, do you think that it's necessarily mandatory or even at all necessary to enroll in post-secondary in 2020? Or do you think that there's still a lot of like uncovered advantages, hidden advantages in going to a more formal education sort of institution?
I think people are trying really hard to preserve and protect and defend the advantages of going to like a set-up institution. I see a lot of people get, very ready to be defensive over going to Berklee College of Music or taking classes right? And that to me is somewhat of a red flag, that there's this strong opposition that people have to the idea of not going to music school. I do think it comes down kind of like how we talked about before, like some people are going to be better at being self-taught in a way, being more independent and removing that accountability, studying yourself at home. Some people are going to excel at that. For other people, that's a really tall order. And for them personally, it might make more sense that they go to a more traditional institution in person, Berklee being the #1 example. But I also think even if you need to be in person, you need to be with people, you need to have that accountability and a person in the room, I think that's okay. But I would pitch the argument of how you spend your tuition money matters. So you can spend 40 grand at Berklee. I'm just making up a expensive number. Let's call it 40 grand. But if you were to take that 40 grand and say, I still need accountability, I still need teachers, how else could I spend this? Dude, first of all, you can get private lessons twice a week with a world-class player. The best of the best are only charging $150 an hour. So that's $600 a month, maybe 7-ish grand a year. Okay, so that's 4 years of private studying with some super shredder. That's certainly really valuable. Or you could look at it and say, what if I spent an entire year going to every clinic, camp, and masterclass that I could afford to go to? You could go to 5, 6, 7 of those a year, and you could do that for 2 or 3 years in a row. If you weigh that against the type of education you get at Berklee, it's a little apples and oranges. They're a little bit different. But holy shit, dude, there's multiple ways to spend tens of thousands of dollars when it comes to self-improvement. And going to a music college is just one of them. It's just one of them. It might be the best for you. I think for a lot of people, it's not. And I definitely get weirded out when people get super defensive about that, as though it's the pinnacle. It's the best of the best. I don't know that that's true anymore. I don't know, especially not when you can get a subscription to every major online drum school, mine included, but also Drumeo, anybody, all of them.
Yep.
For what, $150 a month? Like, dude, try that first. Like, that's a hell of a lot cheaper than 40 grand, 50 grand, 80 grand, whatever it is.
Let's talk about directly after post-secondary for you. Coming out of post-secondary, what was the first thing you did with this music education that you had just sort of acquired? Well, I guess not music education, production education. Sure.
Dude, so first thing was teaching private drum lessons. That was my quickest route to get money. And then I worked at Sam Ash, making $7.75 an hour, I think is what I was making at the time. It was really rough, man. And it's rough too based on location. I was in a weird spot because Full Sail University, like many popular audio schools, they just dump out graduates every month over and over. So the idea of like somebody wanting to work at a studio in Orlando, dude, there's like tens of thousands of those kids, and they snatch up all the free internships. And so the idea you could just walk in a studio and get a job was clearly that wasn't real, at least not here. So I worked at a music store. That was the next thing that I did. And I'm really glad that I did that. I learned a ton about not only about sales, but about different types of drummers. I met every different type of drummer, from the young kids that are super excited and passionate, just want to come in and learn about everything, to the old guys who don't even want to play. They just like collect gear and want to come in and talk about, drums for an hour every day, right? Oh, this whole spectrum of players. So that was a really cool experience that I got working in music sales. But yeah, after that, I think that was my last real job, if I'm being honest, was a stretch at Sam Ash. So in the early days of Orlando Drummer, what were some of the complications that you found when trying to create these lessons for online? Like after shifting out of working in a music store, and now you want to sort of start taking these lessons that you've been doing online, what were some of the big hurdles that you had to get over? I think getting really comfortable with audio and video is overwhelming. In my spot, I had I had an associate's degree in audio. So, I'm not an expert by any means. Like I can set up a drum mix and things like that. In video, kind of the same thing. I was like very mediocre. I had an okay camera and a little bit of background knowledge. And to be honest, talking on camera was the same thing. Like I'm not horrible, but I'm not really that good at it. I think all of those challenges sort of amassed together, right? It was trying to be good at everything is really hard when you first start. And it's definitely taken 10 years to sort of tighten up each one of those categories. I think also, that balance of like reading the market, like what do people want to see? Like what I think is cool is not always what everybody else thinks is cool. And eating some of those early jabs from the market where people just, the universe collectively says like, I know you spent 20 hours making this, but nobody gives a shit. It's not that cool.
Yeah.
You have, right? You got to eat that, right? You got to eat that and move on. And you get better at that, right? I'm sure you've had plenty of videos where you were ultra pumped on it, thought it was going to be awesome, and the universe just said, nope, don't care. And swallowing that pill is like, that's really rough especially when you've never had anything like blow up yet and you don't know how or if the market is going to react to something dramatically. It definitely stings. And I'm going to be honest, the first time you get called a piece of shit, the first time you get called a fag, right? You name the horrible things that people say to you, like acclimating to that and knowing that like with these views comes a lot of negativity. That stuff was all really hard too. It took a long time to just acclimate to it. It's a weird job. It's being a YouTuber in any capacity is strange, really strange.
Yo, I want to talk about that for a second because that's a really, really fantastic point that you bring up. And that's honestly been one of the toughest parts for me in transitioning into in what I do now, because I'm still fairly new to this, into creating content online. What you just said struck me so hard because of something I saw last night. I was watching a YouTube video somebody had made about the Tarzan movie, like the original animation by Disney.
Okay.
And in the comments, one of the higher up comments was he had quoted something that this individual had said, and it wasn't really it wasn't really, like, it didn't strike me as that big of a deal. And then he said, you should take this back or else, and then there was some threats involved. And I read this and I thought, oh my God, it's not just in the metal scene. There's people that are gonna come at you in all places of the internet, because there's no real filter, especially on YouTube in this sort of adolescent version of, I think, where we are with technology and with the internet itself. Because I think as far as we've come, there's still a long ways to go, right? And there's so much reiteration constantly happening on these platforms. What are some tactics and some things that have helped you to sort of, I guess, other than just getting used to it, is there anything specific that you've kind of like done? An example for me was I deleted all the socials off my phone, so I couldn't see comments at all. Is there anything for you that you've specifically done to sort of, I guess, deal with the negative side of what people can throw at you on the internet?
Yeah, I mean, not looking is one way to go for sure. And I did that for years at a time, right? I did the same thing a few years ago, had no apps on my phone, all notifications turned off. That's definitely one way to do it. I think for me, I place an extremely high value on being difficult to offend. Like, I challenge everyone to hurt my feelings. You can try, because I have invested a lot of mental energy and effort into being a very difficult person to offend, right? And I think that's a good quality. The rejection of victimhood, right? You're just not going to hurt my feelings anymore. Not only have I heard everything, so it's funny when somebody makes a comment about something as though they think they're taking a jab, and I'm like, bro, I have seen that 400 times. Like, it's really not offensive the 400th time. It's definitely, the game has changed a little bit with cancel culture. It's a little bit different now because I'm hearing things that I have never heard before. A lot more extreme. I don't want to say accusations, but people just fucking heated,
100%.
Right, and yeah, it's tough, man. I think I also have to remind myself that happy, confident people don't say things like that. When you hear some sort of overt negativity or an attack, it is very rarely coming from a person that likes the position that they're in. So there are elements of jealousy, there's elements of depression and mental health, and you don't get to know any of these things about these people. But I look at it as like, if I'm running like a corner store and somebody comes in and they just say something shitty, like, bro, you got some problems, man. Like, and to me, that's no different than someone coming to a YouTube video you don't have to watch. Nobody invited you here. You clicked it, and then you chose to say something shitty. That's like somebody knocking on my front door and just being like, hey, bro, you're a piece of shit. Like, all right, man, well, sane people don't do that, so I have to assume something's going on in your personal life. And I don't take it personally for that reason. Every negative comment, unless it's like a valid criticism of something, I just assume you got some shit going on that I don't know anything about. So, you know, they almost have my sympathy in a weird way. And I know personally, anytime I've left a gross comment online, it was probably because I was in a bad mood, had something happen to me, and maybe I didn't connect all of those dots. But when I'm having a great day, the last thing on my mind is saying something negative to a stranger on the internet. So, yeah, I hope that's something that I can talk about more, and I hope more people get on that page. But the anonymity of the internet just gives people this weird free pass to say shit that they're not used to having. Because, dude, I've gone to NAMM like many times and had, I'm not trying to, it's not an ego thing, but I've had like, you know, crowds of people around that want to meet and want to say hi and say things, and it's awesome. But never in my life has anybody said anything in person to me like I've heard in YouTube comments, because you would never say that in person. Like, those people would never say that, right? So it's a weird game. It's weird.
That was a really great answer. Thank you for sharing all of that. I think anybody who's getting into this needs to be aware of that, because as hard as you work on your craft and as hard as you work on the content that you're posting, and as long as you work for it, all of a sudden, especially if you really dedicate yourself and you take the time, eventually things start to pop off. And I think for me at least, it was so unexpected. Like, it just came out of left field, where all of a sudden there was negativity coming at me, and I had no idea how to sort of cope with it and adjust to it. And it's definitely taken some time to get used to that. And it's just like a crazy sort of byproduct of what we do. But I want to go back to what we were talking about before with your hurdles. One of the things you mentioned was the audio and video side of content creation. I want to talk about that for a bit, because that's been a big struggle for me as well. I found that, you know, now I'm a drummer, but now I have to figure out how to also be a videographer. I have to also figure out how to be an accountant. I have to figure out how to be an audio tech, a producer. I have to figure out all these different hats that go along with what is this new profession that I stepped into when I got involved with YouTube and started making videos. I kind of feel at times that I'm being lazy with some of the other hats, because I have to sort of dedicate more time to the drum set, right? Like, that's the tough part for me, is like being able to be good at my instrument and put all of the hours into the practice. But now on the side, I have to make sure that at nighttime I'm reading, you know, posts about what camera to buy and how what the, you know, like ISO or aperture exposure. And then on the audio side of things, I kind of had a little bit of a background in audio recording, so I could pre-pro my bands, but I never figured out how to make audio sound good for a finished product on a video. So for me, it's just been more so I focus on the drums, and with each video, maybe I try a little thing, and if that worked out, okay, I'll keep that for the next one and sort of progress through. Is that similar to how audio video kind of came about for you, or did you actually take time and go and sort of look for resources or courses to help you develop your own skills behind the camera and at the DAW?
Sure. I mean, I would say much more the slow and steady route of, you know, what's a good example? Microphones are a good example of, like, picking one microphone that you're interested in and dedicating the whole night to researching it. So starting at 9 or 10 p.m., I bust open the laptop or maybe my phone, and I'm watching every YouTube video I can find. I'm finding audio reviews or forums or blog posts when it came out. And, you know, it's crazy because within 2 or 3 days, you can turn yourself into a relative expert on almost anything. Now, not the whole skill of videography, not the whole skill of recording and mixing drums, but if I told you to become an expert on compression, of snare compression, and you have 1 week to do it, you could totally do it. It's not that hard to understand. And you could apply this to individual factions of a craft, like ISO. Like, I give you the week to learn what ISO is. Look up the history of it. Maybe that's night 1. On the second night, we're looking up ISO ranges. We're going to figure out what those mean. On night 3, we're looking up ISO outdoors versus ISO indoors. By the end of the week, you basically have like a little miniature associate's degree in what ISO is. Next week is aperture. The week after that, shutter speed. The week after that is frame rates. You know, I look at it too as like the amount of stuff that you can learn with the power of the internet is so crazy and limitless. It's just unbelievable. But I think, again, it comes down to like self-discipline. Like, are you choosing to spend the time like teaching yourself these things and using the internet to do it? And it also it becomes habitual. Like, I feel super lazy if I get confused with a camera setting and I'm not Googling it. I feel like a total piece of shit. Like, what am I doing not answering this question? Well, I'm just going to guess? Like, that's not acceptable anymore. I have the internet. I have the resources. I have the time. I will learn this thing and I will figure out how to solve this problem, whether it's audio, whether it's video, things like that. And all of my videos, it's the product of me doing that for 10 years, right? Just no questions go unanswered. I will figure it out, you know? Yeah, just a whole bunch of Googling.
Okay, so I definitely want to dig into this further. When it comes to self-discipline for myself, I don't have any, but I managed to figure out ways into tricking myself into having something. You know what I mean? Like, an example, I guess, would be to speak to what you were just describing, where you kind of compartmentalize certain topics and then progress through them. I wasn't as organized as how you framed it at first, but that's something that I tried to do with the things that I was trying to figure out. Was I would trick myself into, all right, all I have to do is tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I'm going to wake up, and 45 minutes is not much. If I can just get 45 minutes on my cell phone, I won't even get out of bed. Just 45 minutes, I'll watch a couple videos on this, and then it'll probably be able to help me when I do that cover later, or when I shoot that lesson later, or whatever the case may be.
Sure.
Is there certain things that that you have maybe in your toolbox when it comes to self-discipline to sort of force yourself or to compartmentalize a process of learning something?
Man, I think... Okay, well, it would probably be helpful to know a little bit about like my personality, which I'm a very, very extreme person. And when I say extreme, I mean I'm very black and white, very all or nothing with a whole bunch of things. It's how my brain likes to operate. So for me, you know, going the drill sergeant route and removing the option to say no, that's the easiest way for me, right? It's the moderation, the in-between stuff that I struggle with. So I look at like the concept of Googling a microphone and trying to become an expert on that microphone. To me, I like to remove the option. It's kind of like brushing your teeth. Like, do you have to think about brushing your teeth every night? No, it's just ingrained. It's not an option. Your parents didn't give you an option. It's just what we do. And in the same way, if I have the thought about, do I want to research this microphone and learn a little bit? In my mind, the way I work is I remove the option. It's just like brushing your teeth. There is a 0% chance. I already decided that I'm doing it. It's just what I do. And how I feel about it in the moment is totally irrelevant because it's a decision that's already been made. And a tactic you can use for that, or an example of a tactic, is like if you're going to the gym and you're going by yourself, you have to decide when to grab your car keys, when to grab your wallet, when to start the car, when to pull out of the driveway. And even when you're there, you have to decide, am I going to do 3 exercises or maybe that 4th exercise? Am I going to run the mile before I actually start lifting, or am I going to skip that today? But if you go with a friend, all of this shit is already decided. We said we're going to be there at 9 a.m. We said we're hitting chest today. We said we're going on a 2-mile run after. And so it has that sort of built-in accountability. And the way I perceive it is like, I am my own accountability here. I already decided, therefore I don't have the option to say no. It's like I'm breaking a commitment that I already made with myself. And for me, that is somehow easier than like leaving the doors open, where maybe I don't have to Google that thing tonight because I don't really care. Like, I already made up my mind, so that's what I'm doing, right? And if I don't want to do it, that really doesn't matter. It's just like going to the gym with your buddy. You already told him you were going to be there, bro. It doesn't matter if you don't want to go. You said you were doing this, right?
Forced accountability through some kind of external commitment. I really like that. In a literal sense, how could you paint that for somebody taking your lessons, perhaps, or even just anybody trying to learn something online in a kind of like in a similar framework to how you present your content? Like, what are some like literal things that somebody could use every day to make sure maybe they practice, or maybe they do a certain warm-up routine that they've been neglecting?
So I think setting relatively specific goals is going to be helpful when it comes to music itself. So let's just say that you were working on getting your paradiddle speed up, something simple. I would definitely map out, how long do I need to practice these exercises? At what speed am I going to practice them? And I would be very strategic about those things, because the last thing you want to do is walk in the practice room and say, well, maybe I'll figure something out that I can work on today. I vote that you would eliminate that option and make it more of like a workout routine where it's already decided when I'm walking in. How I feel about it the day of practice is really irrelevant, because in a clearer state of mind earlier, I've already decided what exactly it is that I'm doing today. With that said, that might not be the best approach for everybody, but there is no argument that it won't work. It will absolutely work. If you pick a practice routine, any type of regimen, or a self-disciplined like outline of what a day is going to look like, you might not enjoy how that day goes. It might feel like you don't have freedom. It might feel like you're wanting to do something else and I'm doing stuff that I don't want to do. But at the same time, the efficacy of structuring a day like that, or a practice session, there is no argument that this will fail. It will absolutely work for everyone that can do it. It's just a matter of whether or not you can do it, Yeah, that's what I would say, man. There's definitely crossovers with how you could approach practice in this same way of like being a little bit more militant and self-disciplined and structured. Not for everybody, but I think there is some validity to the idea that this will definitely work. How could it not work, right? Of course it will. Okay, so to take that a step further, with the, I want to talk now about a great practice session in your mind and what the parameters are like both physical and like, I guess your mental state going into it. What is like the perfect practice session for you? The time of day, maybe how much coffee you had, anything at all that really contributes to being able to get into the deepest state of flow and develop whatever it is you've been working on. I think first thing is, for me, to ideally retain some information and to really develop muscle memory, all the things that we want to get from a practice session. I like to expand that out over a day, if I'm being honest. My ideal setup is not to have one like hardcore practice window. It's more like off, on, off, on, off, on over like 12 hours. That to me is a little bit more valuable. I'm really big on total recall, as in like you pull information into your mind and you execute the patterns, whatever it is that you're working on. And then we completely do something else. We allow that, the clogged sink theory, right? In behavioral science, they say that your brain is like a clogged sink. You can fill it up with stuff to a certain point, but then you kind of have to let it slowly drip in before you can refill it. And so in my mind, 20 to 30 minute practice sessions with 1 hour breaks in between is ideal, because I allow myself to completely forget what the information was, totally wiped from my mind. Sometimes that takes a full hour until you like get the song out of your head or forget the pattern completely. And then we revisit it. We ask the RAM in our mind to like reboot all of this stuff, or the hard drive, I guess, right? Pull that data all back out of nowhere. Because in all things that you practice, that's the goal. The goal is to be able to pull it from the depths of your mind at a moment's notice, right? So like very, very easily accessible information. And I think the act of practicing, getting on with practice, turning off, and then going back in and practicing, even in the context of like the same day, I think that to me is representative of what it is to learn something musically. It's that you have access to it. You're able to pull it out of the depths of your mind very quickly and instantly utilize it. And so that repetition, pulling the information up, letting it go, pulling it up, letting it go, it's replicating what I believe we want to do anyway, which is pull the information up, use it really quick, and then let it go, right? That's what it's like to play drums, to improvise, to solo. So yeah, that kind of makes sense. Yeah, 100% it makes sense. In fact, it actually inspired me to share a quick story with you. Sure. Well, it's not a personal story. It's just an article that my brother shared with me some years ago that has helped me in my practice. And okay. It's very similar to what you just described, and maybe you guys at home can use this to make better use of your own time at the kit. Something that he shared with me was an article written he found on Reddit by a neurobiologist who has, PhD neurobiologist who was describing not only their research, but how they got through school and achieve that PhD. And what they described was their research led them to use a study structure that looked very similar to what you just described. And what he did in particular was he would give himself a locked-in dead stop of 30 minutes of study.
So every night when he was studying, he would go for 30 minutes. And after the 30 minutes, he would stop and he would take 15 minutes to play League of Legends. And then after the 15 minutes of League of Legends, the video game, he would come back in and do another 30 minutes of deep, focused study. And then he would repeat. And he would do this 3-4 times over the course of a 2-3 hour study session. And what he described was not only did it really help him to deeply internalize the information, but it made it so that each 30-minute or 45-minute chunk of time in which he was engaged with the material was much more tolerable because he knew that his cell phone was going to go off soon. And this pain of trying to internalize this thing that he's not necessarily 100% engaged in like he was the video game, it will end and he'll get a dopamine hit, a serotonin hit with the video game after that deep sort of flow state. And that not only did that help him get through school, but he did a paper on why the brain actually really responds well to that sort of study. So that's really, really cool that you bring up a kind of similar sort of framework in your own practice.
Yeah, it's really valuable. I know one example I can think of, somebody who's talked about this a lot, JP Bouvet has talked about the back and forth sort of studying thing. I've heard him mention that before. I'm sure he's not the only one either. Any educators out there who have like harped on this that I've missed, my apologies. It's definitely a known thing that works really well. And, to expand that out a little further, I tend to have work days that look like this as well, where an ideal work day for me literally spans the 16 hours that I'm awake. But I'm not working a 16-hour day. I'm working an 8-hour day, hour on, hour off, hour on, hour off, hour, right? That's how I prefer to work. So it's like small sprints. It's like interval training, right? Just these really intense bursts of work followed by a rest period. To me, that is way more effective than just smashing the 8 hours together and locking myself in this studio. I tend to get really burned out after 2 or 3 hours where, with color correcting, you can't see the colors anymore. With audio mixing, the snare drum all sounds the same now, right? Like all that blurry shit that kind of happens when you get like too into something.
Yeah.
All of that goes away if I can space out the workday, if I can space out the practice sessions, the editing sessions. And it's just something I figured out in the last few years. I definitely didn't used to be that way, but it just genuinely works better. Works that much better, man.
So I'm going to change the topic a little bit. I have something in common with you, and that's yoga. And not only do I have yoga in common with you, but I also started using yoga actually to correct wrist pains, chronic wrist pain that I was having from playing in my early years of touring because of constant intense practice. I'm really curious to hear how you got into yoga, and not only how you got into it, but how you sort of identified the relationship between a better or an enhancement to your playing through yoga practice.
I think, a lot of people don't care about that like fitness maintenance category. That's really not important to people until something starts hurting. Right? I mean, that's the reason everybody gets into this shit is like, oh, something broke, huh? Like, yeah, makes sense. You'd get into it now. So I think it's difficult to talk to an 18-year-old who has no physical pains. Like or even a 13, 14-year-old, kids like jumping down staircases on skateboards. That was me growing up. Nothing hurt. Everything heals up. It's all good. But like early mid-20s, stuff starts breaking and getting sore. And for me, it was actually my back. I had like weird muscle cramping in like the center of my back. And I got massage. I had physical therapy. And none of that helped at all. And so I kind of had this thought of like, man, if there's some muscle I'm not stretching or I'm not able to hit it or unlock it or something's cramped, I almost need like a whole body approach to figure out what this is. And in doing some yoga classes, by the way, I do yoga online just like I do with drum lessons. I don't go to yoga. I've been to like 3 in-person yoga classes ever, and I hate them. I'm not into like group fitness at all. So I actually take yoga through a website called glow.com, G-L-O. And it's just like subscription based. It's exactly like my own website, right? Just a library of videos. And in doing some of those exercises, I actually found out that I didn't have a back problem. I had a hip problem. And as I found these appropriate stretches for my hips, mainly my psoas muscle, as I unlocked that muscle, the rest of my back kind of unlocked. My back was tightened up because it was compensating for hip problems that I had. And the hip problems were really caused from sitting at the drum set and then sitting at the computer 8, 10, 12 hours a day, right? So it was all kind of tied back to drums. But yeah, man, I feel like yoga is just a really good way to explore what may or may not be happening in your own body, right? It's like exploratory fitness. Like you'll find out what your strengths are and what your weaknesses are and which muscles are sore, which ones you haven't touched in years. Because as soon as we do this position or this stretch, that fucking hurts, doesn't it? Like, yeah, it's because you never used that one, you know? So it's good for just learning about your own body. Yeah, it's awesome, man. And I'm not that like hippie woo-woo of a person at all, but the value of yoga cannot be understated, right? It's just incredibly valuable.
Yeah, I'm not either. And I'm not either. I agree with exactly what you, wow, we have a lot in common, man. That's pretty cool.
Hell yeah.
I've had issues with the psoas as well because of the exact same thing, because of all the hours sitting and editing and because of the drum set, all the hours sitting and practicing. Have you tried the So-Right? Have you seen that thing?
Dude, that overpriced piece of plastic works so fucking well. It is.
I know.
What'd you pay, like $90 for that thing? Something like that.
I don't even have it. My buddy's got it at his place, but he's 5 minutes away, kind of thing. So
yeah,
he's a big yoga guy too. So yeah,
dude, it works, man. And yeah, anybody with hip problems, it's a weird one. I was like hesitant to buy that thing, but holy shit, that thing is awesome.
It's painful, but it does work, yeah.
Super painful, uncomfortable pain, like through the stomach into the back. It's not fun.
The first time I tried it was actually this year at NAMM. I was staying at a friend's house down near the convention, and he had it. And I knew that I've had issues with my So-Right, or my psoas, sorry, my psoas muscles, just because of yoga and understanding, I guess, like some basic anatomy stuff. And I tried it, and I knew about it because of the Joe Rogan podcast. So I tried it there, and I remember the next day going and walking around at the conference, and I was like, it felt great, but it was like one of those really like you had a really great workout, you're sore pains, but still like you can tell you did something good for yourself. You know what I mean?
Sure. Yeah. It's almost one of those muscles like. I don't know how far you gotten into like the bodybuilding world, but like the mind-muscle connection, like you have to learn what that muscle feels like, because as soon as you feel it, you're like, whoa, am I like nauseous or like stomach cramps? It's like, no, dude, that's a muscle in there. Like you just have to like get a connection from your mind to what that feels like. And I'm sure now you've experienced this. You can tell immediately when that thing locks up or when it's not feeling right. You're like, it's that muscle. I need to do these stretches, and boom, it unlocks everything, right? So it's fun for me now knowing what my psoas feels like, because I can fix my back or my hips in like 10 minutes. Whereas before it was just like, you know, a year of agony. Like, why can't I fix this one weird thing? You know, I didn't know what I was looking for. There
was four major consistent muscle groups that I dealt with from my playing and also from the long hours of sitting. The first was the So-Right, or the psoas, excuse me. The second was the wrist. That was the first one. Like the wrist really plagued me. I was wearing wrist braces at one point, and I couldn't, no matter what I did to my wrist, it wasn't solving the problem. It wasn't until I actually opened up my neck and my chest that my wrist felt fine again. Right? It's crazy how interconnected everything is. Exactly, yeah. It was the wrist, and then I had issues with the neck and shoulders later on because I'm a heavy hitter and I got the big cymbals up high.
Very shruggy, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing too is when you're at the computer all day, your shoulders are pulled forward, and then when you're at the drum set, you're playing in front of you. I mean, obviously you want to kind of push yourself back and center over the tailbone the best you can, but you know, the more into the session you get, the more kind of pulled down you become. Sure. And yoga's just yoga plus the So-Right, and then just other you know, ways of maintaining yourself, like running and going to the gym. All that's really helped me a lot with the kit. Another thing too is, and I don't know, maybe you can shed some light on this, I've found that yoga in particular, I've had my best practice sessions after doing an hour of yoga and then sitting at the kit. It's almost like everything is just like clean, you know, like my thoughts are clearer, and my limb coordination is just like, it feels cleaner and smoother.
Yeah, there's definitely an element of wiping your mind, right? And at least focusing on physical things, right? Instead of focusing on external stuff, we go in, we focus on what our body feels like. And it's, you know, a version of meditation like anything else. I think, yeah, I always struggle with, should I do yoga in the morning and give myself a better day? Or should I do it at night and go to sleep better? right? Because that's always like that's where I toggle back and forth. Is I love doing yoga before I go to sleep because I'm a really bad sleeper. So clearing my mind to get like well rested, or yeah, man, doing yoga first thing in the morning just sets your day up way better than if you do nothing at all, right? Just wipes your mind and gets you in gets you in like the appropriate gear, right?
Yeah, 100% agreed. 100%. Yeah, I usually start, and I'm the same way too with online. I've never been in a yoga class, but Lynn, my girlfriend, is like, she's like almost like yogi level addicted to yoga. Okay. She'll do it in the morning, and in the middle of the day she'll stop and just start doing downward dog, and I'll be like, "What are you doing? Like, we're busy, you know?" Like, and then she likes to do it in the evening too. She's crazy with it, but yeah, I've always done it online, and it was really, really profound when I discovered it and the effects that it had on my playing. Okay, so next I would like to spend some time talking about learning songs. I want to talk about how you go about learning a song, but more importantly, I want to start with what's your philosophy on how a drummer should perform a track? Because myself personally, I've always learned songs 1000% note for note. Like I believe personally that if a guitar player plays a chord in a progression wrong, it is not the same song. And I've always felt that if I play the fill differently, it's not the same song. No matter, even if I, in the moment, maybe want to express something differently, I still try my best to stay strict and rigid to how this was originally written, because I believe that it's just like, it just brings it keeps the composition consistent, you know, whether it be on stage, whether it be a cover for my channel, whether it be in a session, no matter what it is, if it's already laid down, I want to respect what's been laid down. But then there's a whole camp of drummers that will go into the studio after listening to what their guitar player wrote out, you know, and they'll jam it maybe 4 days on repeat, and they'll play over it a little bit. They'll go into the studio, they'll have a concept, they'll lay it down, but then they'll let that concept evolve through the touring experience that follows the record release. And you see that a lot with a lot of bands, especially in the metal genre, where you get guys that are live. It's almost like the songs take completely new lives of their own after so many tours. Sure. Which sort of camp do you fall in, or are you somewhere in between?
I think, oh man, I think ethically there is no correct answer. Or morally, right? I think any amount of integrity that you want to infuse into that operation is respectable. So if you say, hey, I want to respect this original composition, that, you know, you're giving a nod to the original drummer, that you created something here and now I'm stepping in. I think all of that is really, really good. I also think there's a huge value in learning people's music note for note, right? Because there's a difference between learning a song and being able to play through it versus learning exactly like which pattern did this guy use in this section? What was the dynamic level of each note in these areas? Like, you really hack into somebody's brain when you study to that level too. So it's also good for you. At the same time, music is inherently communal. It is intended by nature to be shared and manipulated and twisted and things like that. And so I think if we were to look at musical works as a story, right? Like, let's say that you told me a story and I was retelling it to somebody else. I don't really have a choice but to put my own spin on it, right? Like, I'm gonna mess your story up a little tiny bit because I just didn't memorize the way that you said it. And I think, you know, music is kind of like that too. Like, I think we also need to have people putting their own spin on other people's music. I think that's totally acceptable as well. As long as you're not, you know, and it's subjective, but like ruining a piece of music, right? Like totally chopping over a song that was intended to have deep pocket in it. We're getting into weird territory there. But then at the same time, like, I don't want to live in a world where that's not allowed, right? Like, I don't want to live in a world where nobody can touch anybody else's stuff and can't put their own spin on it. So yeah, I don't really think there's like a moral crux here. I think it's really person to person and about what do you want out of this and what do you want to contribute? And everybody has different answers to those questions. What do I want to gain from learning this music? And what do I want to give back from performing it, right? Different answers for different people.
Yeah. Totally, man. So for audience at home, we all eventually develop our own ways, especially if you're learning a lot of songs and you're in a position in which you need to get songs down for commitments to your own professional work with the instrument. How is it that you go about learning a song, and I'd love for you to articulate it in a way that somebody could maybe take these notes down and try out your method for themselves at home.
Sure. So I'm in a weird position in that, God, man, like learning a song is really not something I do very often. I don't do drum covers on my channel. So, I mean, I've done 3, but they were all 7, 8 years ago. My version of learning a song is actually learning the structure of a loop every week, right? We've done 270 of those, something like that, for weeks in a row. So 4 or 5 years. Every week I get a new track, and it has a structure in certain sections, and I have to kind of learn them and then write parts to them. But it's all kind of in the same category of, right, of like getting acclimated to a structure and figuring out what you're going to play in what parts. I think really compartmentalizing is super important for songs. And obviously, that gig that dropped out in 2013. It's been so long, I feel like I can say the band. It was Let Live. I got a gig with Let Live, supposed to go on a 4-month tour. Learned 27 songs in 2 or 3 months. So that was like my heaviest experience of learning songs and complicated songs. And I remember one of the most helpful things was really like isolating and looping even specific parts of like a verse. So like the first 2 measures of verse number 2 would have been a whole day, right? And I mean, literally taking the song and chopping it up in Logic and exporting a looped version of a specific section of music so I could drill whatever the pattern was. That's kind of would be my first approach to a complicated song. If it's a less complicated song, like in the pop world or the rock world, where the sections are a little bit more predictable, what's going to happen, the structure is a little more predictable. In my mind, I'd like to spend a week just playing almost by ear. Let me just learn the song like from a fan's perspective, as though this was something I had heard on the radio so many times that it's now stuck in my head. And I would try to not be analytical of the parts right off the bat, to genuinely learn the song from a fan's perspective, and then sort of increase how analytical I become leading up to the gig, in theory, right? That by the time I'm 2 weeks out from the gig, I'm looking at individual ghost notes. I'm looking at dynamic levels from section to section. Maybe I have a day focusing on transitions, but I think that would be my best answer, right? Starting out as a fan, learning the song, learning the structure, and then compartmentalizing and isolating your parts as needed, right?
Right on, man. Hell yeah. I have a very similar process. That's very cool to hear.
Hell yeah.
Now I want to talk, you brought up the loops, so I'd love to talk about that next.
Sure.
Okay, so yeah, how is it that you get a new loop each week? Where does the loops come from? First question.
Sure. So it comes from my buddy Joe Hodgen, who has worked with me since that band Stockholm. We met literally off Craigslist, forming this band Stockholm. That was in 2014, 15-ish. Maybe even earlier, man. Hard to remember, to be honest. 2013. But yeah, he was a producer, guitar player, full-time teacher. So him and I hit it off right away. We had little audio, little video experience, you know, both teachers. And we had tried to find different ways to work together for quite a while. And finally we said, hey man, we could write some like play-along tracks. And so we started doing that back then. And it's cool. It just turned into like, honestly, I can tell you the way we have it set up. It's a long-term licensing agreement where from his perspective, this is an investment long term. So every month that he adds, well, 1 loop a week. So every week that he adds a new loop, I pay him a slightly higher fee for the library of loops. So licensing is another word for renting. I effectively rent the loops from him.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's kind of the setup that we have. So it's cool from him because he gets guaranteed income that just, it accrues, you know, it gets higher and higher over time. So from his perspective, he wants to do this into infinity because it just means he gets more money into infinity. And it's cool because it allows me to do whatever I want with the loops. I can sell them individually. I can stream them to my members. I can give them away if I choose to give them away. So it's cool. It gives us both a lot of freedom to do whatever we want. And everybody's happy, man. So it's been a really, really cool setup. And some of them I'll go over and write with him. Depends on what the track is. But a lot of times he's on his own. You know, we do a country pack and just send the country loops, bro. It's easy.
So now in regards to the loops, as far as your own creative process and bringing it to life using your instrument. I'd love to talk about that. So what are some things when you get a new loop and you've listened to it a couple times and you sit down at the kit and you start to put yourself over top of it, what are some things that you're paying close attention to and you're thinking strongly about, and how is it that you're choosing, you know, in which ways to express yourself, and what elements of the kit to use at certain times? What are some of the philosophies that go into you actually creating the drum lines for these?
Sure, that's a great question, man. I think I always try to immediately find that balance of like, what should be played over this track? Not what I want to play, not what my ears hear, but if I was to Wikipedia the drum sound that should go to a country music song, right? Like, what's the standard that somebody would play, like a really traditional session guy? And so I try to figure out what that is, and I start there. I start by playing what I think I would charge money to play, right? If someone said, hey, man, I'm gonna give you money to lay down some drums on this track, I'm going with the safe, predictable, appropriate drum parts. And then from there, it's like exploring the boundary of like, how much of my own flavor can I put on this before I'm just being ridiculous, right? It's important to me that I show people in the loops that the intention is not for you to play traditional parts and grooves over these. I really don't care what you want to play over these, because I look at them as like a supplement to a metronome. That's how I perceive them, right? So you can just treat this as like a musical environment to work on whatever you want. And so there is an element of me trying to go outside of the box in some of the loop videos, because I just want to show people that like, hey, I know it's an EDM track, but like I don't have electronic stuff here. So I'm going to make some shit up on the hi-hats and the crasher hat and this stacker. And I thought it was kind of cool, right? It might not be what you play on an album. If I got a gig with an EDM band, I probably wouldn't play any of that stuff. But it's sort of a demonstration of like, you can push this boundary a little bit, because that's what these are for. Like, they're practice resources, they're practice tools. So yeah, I start with the traditional approach and then see how far I can push that boundary to demonstrate like, you can do whatever you want here, you know?
So along the lines of element choices, something that has always been extremely inspiring to me about your loop videos and just a lot of your performance videos that I watch on your Instagram and on your YouTube is your incredibly well contrasting cymbal choices. So I'd love to talk about what inspires you about different cymbals and how you go about choosing what cymbals to mix with other cymbals, I guess not only at certain times in the playing, but just at the kit in general, so that you have a well-rounded sound.
Sure. I mean, my cymbal setup has definitely changed and adjusted a little bit over the years. I used to go a lot drier, darker, dirtier, and earthier than I do now. I would say a really important thing to me too is like, when I'm playing flowing around the kit, improvising or shedding or whatever, I tend to not like sounds that overpower what I'm playing. So for example, if you got a 22-inch crash ride on your left side above your tom, like this one, and you're gonna hit that during busy playing where there's other ghost notes and things happening around that musically, that's gonna cover up a lot of the sound happening. So all of my attraction to the drier, darker sounds is because I like them to disappear and get out of the way, because I think I have I have like a busy play style. And so I feel like big, giant, you know, swooshy cymbals, something about them just covers up too much of my playing. I want my cymbals a little more in and out. So the fast nature of a couple of my crashes is kind of rooted in that. I think when it comes to like rides, I think for me, like, versatility, you know, versatility is like the #1 thing. Like, I like them to be really balanced. I have to be able to crash my ride. It has to sound good with the stick. The bell has to work. If any of those pieces are missing, I'm not really interested. So to me, that's like a core element of the ride cymbal is versatility. And then I would say in the hi-hat, stacker, and splash department, I've sort of gone more like down the middle, right? Like I want them to be aggressive and a little bit attacky to cut through my mix, but at the same time, like, I don't know, I like them to sit in as much as they possibly can. So I prefer like softer stacks, not so like super bitey and aggressive. Same with hats, you know, it's the reason I stopped using the sand hats, like a little too much cut for me. I wanted them to sit lower. So 15-inch jazz hats is what I use now. But yeah, man, I mean, I'm glad you like the setup. It's one of those things where it's so personal preference. Like I've literally heard people be like, bro, your whole cymbal setup sucks. These all sound the same. This is fucking horrible. Like, all right, I'm just sorry you feel that way, man. But yeah,
So while we're on the topic of cymbals, 2 questions. First off, we'll package this together. First off, what appealed to you? You were one of the guys who I played a bunch of different random cymbals coming up, because we all do. We don't really know what we want,
Sure.
and what the differences are, and what the differences in the companies are, of course. But you were one of the guys who really introduced me to Meinl, and you were also it was the texture in your cymbals that I was like, well, that doesn't sound like all the A customs at my kit. Oh my God! Like, listen to what he's doing with these cymbals. So what I guess first appealed to you about the Meinl cymbal collection, and why do you play Meinl cymbals? And then also, could you just take us after that through what cymbals you currently have at the kit?
Sure. So for me, I think the initial attraction to Meinl was how individualistic it seemed. Right? It was not what I was used to. It seemed to be like the alternative cymbal company that had this cool factor to it. So initially, that was all it was, right? It was just like, this is different. It's just not what everyone else is doing. And that was just inherently appealing to me, to just do something different. Of course, it takes time to fall in love with certain cymbal lines, to understand what they were going for and what this sound works for, what it doesn't. That definitely took a little bit of time to understand what my sound was. My first Meinl setup, I think maybe there's one cymbal, this one, the 19 extra dry thin crash. That's the only cymbal that's still the same. Everything else has been kind of swapped out over the years. But the individualistic nature of Meinl as a brand, that's what got me in first. You know, and as far as why I'm a Meinl artist now, it's still kind of similar to that, right? I mean, they have very specific sounds that you'd have a hard time replicating with any other company. It's just true. They make weird shit that other people don't make, right? Beyond that, like beyond that is a lot of brand integrity. I love how Meinl operates. I love how they treat their artists. I love that they have a stellar reputation across the board. These are more like business things, like less applicable to somebody who just wants to buy some cymbals. But I can tell you that integrity that I've seen for 6-7 years being a Meinl artist is, man, it's true all the way through to the customer level. Like, you know, whether it's warranties or replacing cymbals or customer service or questions, things like that. Gotta keep in mind, I know people in Meinl that you wouldn't see on the front line, product managers, and you know, the level of integrity that company maintains is crazy. So yeah, there's 1,000 reasons why I'm a Meinl artist, to be honest. And what was the other question? Like what is my cymbal setup now? Yeah,
just if you want to go like left to right and just take us through what you currently got at the kit.
Sure. So I have 15-inch jazz thin hats, which sit against the 12-inch snare. So it's like, that's one of the weirder things that everybody says when they see my kit is mega hats and tiny snares, something I just got used to. Yep. So 15 jazz thins. My left crash is a 19-inch extra dry thin crash, and I really dig that size. The 18 is not quite loud enough for me. It just feels like it's a little quieter because it's just smaller. And the 20, like it lasts like a millisecond too long for me. So the 19, I know a lot of people don't play 19s, but it's got this weird perfect blend of both of them. So that's always been one of my favorite left crashes. I'm now playing the 22-inch Foundry Reserve Light Ride, which is a big...
Oh, that's...
This sucker here.
That's a beautiful cymbal.
Really, dude, it's such a beautiful cymbal, man. It's really swooshy and buttery, and I feel like it's like if you don't like this cymbal, I just don't think you like cymbals. I would compare it to, honestly, like a Constantinople. Like if you've heard like a really good Zildjian Constantinople, like I don't care what cymbal brand you play, if you don't like that cymbal, I think you just have like shitty ears for ride cymbals, right? Like it objectively sounds awesome. And I think the Foundry Reserve, they all fall in that category. Like I really don't care what you play. You gotta admit that thing sounds really good, you know? So I love that about it. It's just universally loved. Further right, so this crash here is the 20-inch traditional hand-hammered thin crash. That's like my most normal crash. It's just, if you just looked up the definition of like a good sounding crash cymbal, it's that one. Really traditional, just a perfect crash sound. And then I have a much softer, kind of a lower volume crash to my far right, which is the 20-inch vintage crash. That's a really mellow crash cymbal. And then for stacks, I have the Crasher hats right above my bass drum, which are like those little auxiliary, tiny, bitey hi-hats. And then my 16-inch stack is a 16-inch vintage trash crash. So the Meinl 16-inch crash with some weird holes in it. And then it's got a 12-inch traditional splash on top. And it's like I said, it's a really soft, non-aggressive stacker. It's almost got like a buttery kind of swish to it. Kind of the opposite of like the bullet stack, like Luke Holland stack. Kind of the opposite of that, right? And I don't play metal, so I don't really need anything that aggressive. I got a China that I'll drag over here if I ever need to do that.
Yeah, gotcha. Cool. All right, so I want to talk. I want to stay on the gear topic for a little bit longer. I want to talk now about. I guess, a little bit more literal for the audience. I want to talk to somebody in their first maybe 3 or 4 years, and how they can go about finding. How you would suggest to somebody who's just starting to develop their own sound and their own voice at the kit, how would you suggest to them going about figuring out what pieces of gear work best for them? Obviously, a lot of that probably just comes down to trial and error, but what sort of tips and tricks could you give to somebody who maybe doesn't really, like, there's so many options. And the thing about drums is knowing your equipment and being able to play it is so integral to the instrument. Like, understanding what pieces to put at the kit is your sound, right? So how can somebody who's just sort of, I guess, getting into this world make it a little bit less overwhelming for them?
Sure. I think, it's a tricky question, right? Because like you said, gear and your ability to play it and your comfort levels are all so tied in together. And the unfortunate reality is that there is no like shortcut to that. Like, it legitimately takes 5 or 10 years plus to have messed with your kit enough to know that I love my snare at this height, I like my rack tom at this angle. Like, if somebody says that in their first 2 or 3 years of playing, like, this is a little mean, but like, I almost call bullshit. Like, you don't know yet. Like, you don't know. You haven't done this long enough to have experimented with all of these different variables and get comfortable with your tom at this angle. Do that for 6 months. Then let's try changing it and moving it here and sliding it down. Play some different material on it. What happens? How does it feel? So there is an element of time that has to come into play. Like, you have to do these things over a long period of time. I think one of the best traits that a younger drummer could have, though, in trying to get supremely comfortable with their setup and make it their own, I think the best thing you can do for yourself is have a willingness to experiment. So even if you hate what a high ride cymbal looks like, try putting it up there anyway. Like, that's one weird example for me where I always thought that looked so dumb. I thought people were trying to show off. I thought it was, I don't know. I just didn't see the value in doing that. None of my favorite drummers did it. But I had somebody kind of explain to me one day, like, why they did it, why it made sense for them, and how it adjusted their technique a little bit. And I said, you know what? Let me just try it. I'll just throw it up there and just try it. And dude, within 2 or 3 weeks, it was like, holy shit, this is for me. This is 100% for me. Like, I actually love this. And I don't know, a willingness to experiment with that sort of stuff may have changed my setup much sooner, but I wasn't really willing to do that because I had some sort of idea of like the types of drummers that had a high ride cymbal. And so it's just one, right? It's just one example of like, another good example is like in funk players, old school funk players, sometimes take their hi-hat and their snare like real close together, like a super low hi-hat to get on top of the hi-hat because they're not really digging shoulders that much. I don't know, man. There's likely some people out there where like that fits them. That's their style. That's the vibe they want. They don't mind how it looks. But because they grew up on Travis Barker having a hi-hat that was 2 feet above the snare, that's just how it's always been for them, right? And so they don't know. They might be struggling with playing certain things they're trying to learn because their setup doesn't necessarily match that. And it's unfortunate that they might not have a teacher or somebody, to tell them, hey, dude, let's drop that hi-hat down for a couple weeks and see what happens. You might love it. You never know. So yeah, willingness to experiment is like the best thing I could tell anybody. Just move shit around. Like, it's going to take you 10 years anyway, but it might take 20 if you think you already got it down and it's locked in and perfect, right?
Okay, so while we're on the topic of gear, of course, I want to talk about the shells now. So I guess I would like to kind of run through the same sort of thing we did with the cymbals with the shells. So like, what is it in sonar? And then not only just sonar, but like, what is it that you're looking for when you're picking not only maybe the width, but the depth and the wood type and the amount of ply, and then how do you pair that with heads? Just give me a rundown on how you get your tone out of your kit and why it has evolved that way.
Sure, sure. So I think first thing, just full disclosure, I'm not a Sonar artist. I never have been. I think they make absolutely world-class, beautiful drums. It kind of like the Foundry Reserve. If you don't like Sonar drums, I just don't think you like drums very much. Like they're an incredible drum maker. But I've never directly been affiliated with them, never been an artist, so I don't have a reason to lie about Sonar at all. This kit in particular is an interesting one. It's a relatively thin-shelled kit, and that's a feature that I love in almost all drum sets, is very, very thin shells. There's a hollow, focused projection that comes when you get to those thinner shelled kits. So for me, that's like the number one thing, is 7 millimeters max on my shell sizes. And really, I could go as low as like 5, like super, super thin shells. So I like the focus and the projection that comes from that. As far as like regular kit sizes, I've gone smaller and smaller over the years. A 20-inch bass drum for sure. A lot of that is, and this is a weird thing to say, but like when you're somebody in my position whose content is played back 80% over mobile speakers, I have to be honest about, right? I have to be really honest about, dude, the level of low end that is not heard. Like, it's all the low end. It's all the low end, right? Like, an 18-inch floor tom and a 24-inch kick drum have no value to me. They will literally never be perceived by my audience because I know how they're watching my content, and it's through these little tiny speakers, but you're not hearing any of that stuff. There's just no way. So I've progressively shrunk my kit down, knowing that the attack, the bite, and the focus of a smaller drum is just more audible through phone speakers, right? It's just a weird reality of the job of a content creator, right? If I was playing live and doing gigs, I might feel differently, right? I know an 18-inch floor tom live on stage, mic'd up through a big sound system, it sounds sick. It sounds sick. I'm just not in that position, right? So with that smaller kit size in mind, I play 10, 14, 16 for toms. I have a deep aversion to 12 and 13-inch toms. I don't know why. I have hated those size toms since I was really, really young. A little more difficult to tune, but I don't know, man. I love the spring and the bounce of a 10-inch, and 14, 16 always felt right over on the floor. Yeah, 20-inch kick drum, and then snare. Every time I've gone smaller, I liked it. I went from a 14-inch DW snare down to a 13-inch Benny Greb snare, and the snare I play now is my signature snare through Entity Drums, which is the 12x5 Jara, like tiny, tiny little snare. And a lot of it is what you get used to, right? I'm just used to tiny drums now, so it's just like, that's what I think of. It's weird when I get on somebody that plays like 13, 16, 18, 24. Like I feel like I can only play rock. I just have to smash these. That's the only thing I'm allowed to do, you know?
100%. Yeah, man. I'm in the exact same boat. One of the most common comments that I'll get on one of the most common negative comments I'll get on a lot of my drum cover performances is people saying like, why is your kick drum punchier than your rack or your floor? Like, how is it? Why do you have it so high? And yeah. I just reply to everybody the same. I'm like, well, what did you watch this on? You know what I mean? Yeah. It's like, that's a really great point. It's like, you have to know your audience. You have to know what the application is for you, you know?
Sure.
And this is something that comes into play with, I think with all equipment, depending on what type of drummer you are, you know? Like in the metal scene, when you go live and you see bands on stage, it looks cooler to have a big kit, and it looks cooler to have big, washy, huge cymbals. But then when you're in the studio, like, producers are gonna prefer an 18-inch A custom over your 22-inch, like, washy whatever it is with all the excess overtone that they have to try and avoid and put in a place, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like, it's really important to understand where your music is gonna be consumed and how you can choose gear that will work in that situation the best.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gets tough for younger drummers because they have to balance this out with aesthetics, right? They want their kit to look a certain way, regardless of whether or not it fits the music. And so that's like a musical maturity thing. You have to kind of figure out what that real balance is. Because yeah, maybe you want a mega drum set, but because you think that looks amazing, but you're playing in a band where that just doesn't fit at all. Yeah, and that gets into like wood type as well. Same sort of thing, right? Like your preferred drum sound might be maple, but if you're playing a certain type of music, maybe birch works better. Maybe I don't know, mahogany works better if you need real low end, whatever it is. And for me, like I play a birch kit because for the same reason I play small drums. Like I want an attacky, aggressive, cutting, high-end sort of sound because of where I know this music is going to be consumed, right? Yeah, it's tough, man. I would just say to like younger drummers, like just be open to everything. Be open to everything, you know? And that takes time. It might take 10 years before you're able to physically get in front of a maple kit, a birch kit, a poplar kit, right? And actually learn what works for you, you know? It's, you got to play a long game with it. Try everything.
So while we're still on the topic of gear, there's one last thing I want to cover, and that is not only are you creating the sounds with the drums, but if you can't capture it properly, well, it doesn't really matter what gear you choose. So what microphones do you use and where and why?
Sure. So I use Earthworks almost exclusively, not all the way. I've got a few other mics sort of mixed in. Earthworks, the DK7 pack is mainly what I'm using, and then I have the QTC 30s, which are like their Omni overhead mics.
Yep.
To be honest, the like principle of Earthworks was something really, really appealing to me because their whole thing is like ultimate transparency. We're not coloring the sound. By coloring, I mean like an EQ profile where it's going to automatically do a little bit of something to your sound. Earthworks thing is the opposite of that. We want to basically create a replica of what you hear in the room. That when you hear an Earthworks mic record a tom, it sounds as similar as possible to what you actually heard. And so there's two huge benefits to that in my mind. One is that I paid for an expensive drum set and expensive cymbals because they sound good. Like, why would I want to mess with the sound on the way into the computer? Like, let's at least bring it in. Like, I want to hear what I paid for. I don't want to manipulate it. Like, I bought a good sounding drum set. Let's hear this thing before we actually touch it. I can EQ later if that's what I'm going to do. So I like that in and of itself. And I also think the other half of it is the honesty required in educational content. You know, if you're making a drum cover, to me it's performance art. So if you're going to, you know, edit the sound of the snare, edit the sound of the kick drum, if you're sampling, if you're replacing, if you're quantizing in Pro Tools, to me, that doesn't really bother me. It bothers me if somebody lies about it. But if you're being honest and you just say, hey, I manipulated this music digitally to get a certain sound, like, what do I care? I don't think there's anything wrong with that. People do it on albums all the time, right? But in education, there's a catch there, because if I quantize, or not even quantization, let's just say compression. If I compress the hell out of my snare and I play a ghost note exercise for you and it sounds like my ghost notes are loud as shit the whole time, you would have an incorrect idea of what this is supposed to sound like when you play it. Right? There's like an audio transparency that I have to have, because I got to be really careful to never be dishonest about the sound that I'm presenting, right? It's one of the reasons I can't like edit my drums in a drum lesson, because that's just not fair. Like, I'm showing you something that you're not actually going to be able to do. And compression on the snare is like a perfect example. Like, these dynamic levels need to be relatively accurate. And so kind of like that's sort of Earthworks' whole thing, is that these are accurate, transparent sounds that give you the most honest depiction of what this actually sounded like. And I think that goes right in line with educational content as a whole. It's supposed to be transparent. Kind of has to be, right?
Yeah, man, that's an awesome answer. That it seems to be the theme of this whole equipment talk, that understanding who your audience is, where they're consuming your content, and then picking gear that's appropriate for those situations is just vital.
Yeah, hell yeah, man.
Cool. So yeah, I mean, we're pretty much coming to the end. I guess the last couple things that the last thing I'd love to talk about is just if you could go back and give a younger, I guess more immature version of yourself some pieces of gold advice, and you could make it like, you could package something for yourself that would drastically improve your own progression getting to where you are now. Maybe just to get there faster, or to avoid some big potholes. I mean, obviously in a perfect world you can't do the likes of that, but for people at home, maybe there's something we can share, or you can share, that will really speed up their own progression. What would maybe 1 or 2 points be along those lines?
Sure. I think one of the biggest ones, and this is like more of like a life lesson thing I think everybody has to wrestle with, being brutally honest with yourself, right? So if you suck at something, the quicker you can say, I suck at this thing and I'm going to try and get better, dude, the better off you are. And it's across the board, whether it's a camera setting you don't know, a thing that you don't know how to play. And I feel like education in itself gifted me this because when I was really young, 18, 19, teaching drum lessons, I would get stumped. I would get stumped by kids who had really good questions that I couldn't answer. And I remember being faced with these like specific moments of like, do I bullshit this kid and say that I kind of know the answer even though I don't? Or do I straight up say, I have no idea, let's figure it out. I have no clue. Let's start there. And we'll get better at this together. I'll have an answer for you next week, right? That was my first introduction to like that very high level of accountability with yourself. So my advice to myself would, 10 years ago or 20 years ago would be, bro, you need to be willing to admit what you suck at because that's the only way you're going to get better, right? And education, again, it helped me so much with that because I just found myself unable to lie to students or to myself. It was just like, bro, you can play it or you can't, and it's the same with camera settings. You either know what this button does or you don't know what it does, right? Like, let's be honest. I don't know what this button does, so I'm going to Google it. I'm going to bust open the manual. Now I know. As opposed to, and we've all known people like this, people that would rather give you the impression that they know something than let you know that they have no idea what's going on. To me, that's like a massive inhibitor of growth, the inability to say, I don't know. And I've trained myself, I've certainly gotten better with it over the years, to very quickly identify what I'm not good at and shoot my hand up and go, hey, I don't fucking have any idea what I'm talking about. I don't know. I'd love to learn. Tell me what's going on here. Let's learn. Let's Google together. Let's figure it out. That willingness is something that I could have used a long, long time ago. Just dropping your ego and admitting what you suck at.
Amazing, man. Perfect. Well, I can't thank you enough for taking the time to do this today. I had such a great time sitting down and getting to talk and get a bit of your story and get some really, really incredible advice in all these different subjects. So thank you so much for doing this, Adam. I really appreciate it. And I hope you guys all enjoyed at home.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, brother. This was an awesome time, man. I appreciate it.
Of course. Okay, everybody. Thank you so much for checking this out. And I'll see you guys in the next one.